The snow began falling over the Nebraska sandhills on the 20th of December, 1889, 3 days before Christmas, and it did not stop for the better part of a week. Silas Hartwell counted his last coin twice that afternoon, turning it over in his cracked palm as though a second look might somehow multiply it, before walking the 2 miles into the small town of Cottonwood Falls to spend it on a single tin of milk for his son Abel, not yet 2 years old, and too thin for a winter this hard. He did not know, standing at the mercantile counter handing over his final cent, that a woman he had spoken to exactly once in his life would leave something at his door before dawn that would leave him standing in the snow, utterly speechless, unable for several long minutes to understand what he was looking at. Constance Whitfield watched him through the mercantile window from across the street, recognizing the particular careful way a desperate man counts a coin he cannot afford to lose, and something in her chest, quiet and guarded for 3 long years, stirred in a way she did not immediately understand herself. Silas Hartwell had once run a small dairy operation on the edge of Cottonwood Falls, a modest herd of 6 cows that had provided a decent, honest living until a wasting sickness swept through the herd 2 winters back and took every animal within a single terrible month. His wife Eliza had died the following spring, worn down by a grief and exhaustion that a doctor 40 miles distant called simply a weakened heart, though Silas privately believed she had lost the will to keep fighting once the herd was gone and their small savings with it. He had buried her beneath a lone elm on the property he could no longer afford to keep, sold what remained of his equipment for a fraction of its worth, and moved with Abel into a single rented room above the Cottonwood Falls livery stable, taking whatever day labor the town offered through a winter that had grown crueler with each passing week. Constance Whitfield owned the largest cattle operation in the county, land her late husband Edmund had built into the most prosperous ranch for 30 miles in any direction, before a fall from his horse broke his neck 3 years earlier on a frozen November morning, much like this one. She was 39 years old, and she had spent those 3 years running the ranch with a competence that had earned her respect from every rancher in the county. Though the house itself had grown quieter each year, the nursery down the hall having sat empty since a pregnancy 8 years into her marriage had ended before it properly began. Constance had seen Silas exactly once before, 3 weeks earlier, when he had come to her ranch asking after day labor and she had turned him away for lack of need, a decision she had regretted quietly ever since, without quite understanding why a single stranger's disappointment should linger with her so persistently. Watching him now through the mercantile window, spending what was unmistakably his very last coin on a single tin of milk while his own coat hung threadbare against the falling snow, something in Constance finally moved past regret into action. She did not approach him. Some instinct, careful and deliberate, told her that a man counting his last coin in front of witnesses did not need a wealthy stranger's pity offered publicly at a mercantile counter, however well intended. Instead, she quietly asked the mercantile owner, a kind man named Otis Bennett, who had known both families for years, exactly which room above the livery Silas Hartwell called home, and by that evening she had begun making arrangements that would not require Silas to accept anything from her hand directly, not yet, not in a way his exhausted pride would have to argue against in front of anyone watching. Before dawn on the 23rd of December, while snow still fell steadily over Cottonwood Falls, Constance's ranch hand, Thomas Pryor, made a quiet delivery to the base of the livery stairs, exactly as she had instructed, and rode away again before the town had properly woken. What Constance left at Silas's door shocked him so completely that he stood in the snow for several long minutes, simply staring, unable at first to make sense of what he was seeing. It was not a single basket of charity, easily refused or returned. It was a fully outfitted crate of winter provisions, flour and dried meat and preserved vegetables, enough to last well past the worst of the season, alongside a proper wool coat sized for a small child, 2 knitted blankets, and, tucked carefully at the top where he could not possibly miss it, a full case of fresh milk, 12 tins carefully packed in straw against the cold. There was no note, no name, nothing to indicate who had left it or why. Only the crate itself sitting in the snow like something delivered by circumstances too generous to explain themselves. Silas carried the crate upstairs with hands that trembled from more than just the cold, and it took him the better part of an hour, sitting beside Abel's small sleeping form, to understand that this could not possibly be an accident or a mistake meant for someone else. He knew, without being able to prove it, exactly whose hands had arranged this, remembering the woman who had turned him away from ranch work 3 weeks earlier, with an expression that had seemed, even then, more apologetic than dismissive. He walked to the Whitfield ranch that same morning, the crate's careful, anonymous generosity weighing on him too heavily to simply accept in silence, and found Constance on her porch, watching the snow with the same quiet, guarded expression he remembered from their first meeting. "You left this at my door," he said, not quite a question, holding up one of the milk tins as evidence. Constance's composure flickered, caught plainly in the act of a kindness she had hoped to keep anonymous. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Hartwell," she said, though her voice lacked any real conviction behind the denial. "I don't take charity, ma'am," Silas said, his voice carrying the same exhausted pride that had carried him through 2 years of quiet, grinding hardship. "Whatever kindness you intended, I can't accept a stranger's provisions without some way of earning them honestly." Constance studied him for a long moment, weighing something behind her careful expression, before finally abandoning the pretense entirely. "Then don't think of it as charity, Mr. Hartwell," she said. "Think of it as a wrong I intend to correct. I turned you away from honest work 3 weeks ago because I told myself I had no need of another hand. When the truth is, I've been short-handed on this ranch since Edmund died, and simply hadn't the courage to hire someone new and let a stranger see how much I've struggled to hold everything together alone. I have work, real work, managing my dairy operation, which has sat neglected for 3 years because I know cattle and grazing, but precious little about milk production. You ran a dairy once. I need someone who understands it properly, and I was too proud 3 weeks ago to admit how badly I needed exactly the help you were asking me for." Silas stared at her, disbelief plain across his weathered face. "You're offering me my old work back," he said slowly, dressed up as an apology for turning me away the first time. Constance's chin lifted, though something softer moved behind her composed expression. "I'm offering you honest employment because I have a genuine need for your particular knowledge," she said, "and because I find I cannot walk past a man counting his last coin for his son's milk and pretend I didn't see it, whatever pride either of us brings to the conversation afterward." Silas looked down at the milk tin still in his hand, then back toward town, where Abel waited above the livery stable, and something in his exhausted resolve finally allowed itself to bend. "I'll need to see the dairy operation," he said, "before I can properly say what wages the work is worth." Constance almost smiled, the first genuine warmth Silas had seen cross her careful expression since they'd met. "Then come inside out of this snow first, Mr. Hartwell," she said, "and we'll discuss it properly over coffee, like two reasonable people conducting honest business rather than strangers arguing on a porch in a blizzard." The dairy cottage, when Silas and Abel moved into it 2 days later, smelled of cold stone and long disuse, but the hearth drew easily once he coaxed a fire, and by nightfall the small front room had begun to feel less like an abandoned structure and more like something that might, with time, become a real home again. He laid Abel in a borrowed cradle near the fire and sat beside him through most of that first night, watching his son sleep undisturbed and warm for the first time in longer than Silas cared to remember, a small, ordinary mercy that struck him harder than he expected after 2 years of grinding, quiet hardship. By the second morning, Abel had discovered the cottage's small window overlooking the dairy barn and stood pressed against the glass for the better part of an hour, watching the cows move slowly through the frozen pasture, delighted by something as simple as animals he could finally call familiar rather than strange. The dairy operation, when Silas inspected it 2 days after Christmas, had indeed fallen into considerable disrepair. Milking equipment rusted from disuse, a small herd of 8 cows kept more out of habit than proper management, production a fraction of what the land and animals were genuinely capable of yielding. Silas spent that first week rebuilding what he could with his own hands, repairing stalls, restoring proper milking schedules, and within a month, the operation's output had nearly tripled. The extra income, a welcome addition to a ranch that had quietly bled money in small, neglected corners for 3 years running. He and Abel moved into a small cottage near the dairy barn, modest but sound, with a working hearth and enough room for a proper nursery corner that Abel claimed with the delighted, uncomplicated joy of a child who had never known such warmth before. Silas never once asked Constance for anything beyond his agreed wages, and when she left a basket of preserves at the cottage door one evening, he returned half of it the following morning with a brief note explaining that Abel had plenty already. Their early weeks together were not entirely without friction. In mid-January, Constance arranged for a proper crib to be delivered to the cottage without first asking Silas's permission, assuming the gesture would be welcomed as simply another practical improvement to the dairy operation's living quarters. Silas met the delivery wagon at the door with his jaw set, his old pride flaring sharply at what felt, in that unguarded moment, like charity dressed up once again as employment. "I can build my son a crib myself, Mrs. Whitfield," he said, more sharply than he intended, when Constance rode down to see the matter settled. She studied him for a long moment before responding, her own composure steady despite his tone. "I don't doubt that you can," she said, "but you've been repairing my dairy equipment 12 hours a day for 3 straight weeks, Mr. Hartwell, and I'd rather you spend your one evening of rest with your son than hunched over a workbench proving a point to me. Accept the crib. Build him something else entirely if it eases your conscience." Silas stood there a long moment, feeling the sting of his own overcorrected pride, before finally nodding once, gruffly, and thanking her properly. It was a small disagreement, quickly settled, but it taught them both something important about where the line between help and charity actually sat, a lesson neither forgot in the months that followed. Constance found herself walking to the dairy cottage most evenings, first under the excuse of reviewing production figures herself, though the truth ran deeper with every visit that passed. She brought Abel small wooden toys and sat with him by the hearth while Silas finished his evening rounds, discovering in herself a tenderness toward the boy that startled her more than she cared to admit after 3 years of careful, guarded solitude following her own quiet loss. One evening she found a small carved wooden cow resting on the cottage porch rail, a fitting joke given his new work, no note attached, the wood still faintly warm from the whittling knife. And she knew, without needing to ask, exactly whose hands had made it, keeping it in her coat pocket for 3 days before she found the words to thank him properly, laughing despite herself at his quiet sense of humor buried beneath so much careful reserve. Not every week passed smoothly. In late January, a sudden cold snap threatened to freeze the dairy's water supply entirely, and Silas worked through 2 full nights running insulating the pump lines and keeping a fire burning constantly near the wellhead to prevent the herd from losing access to water during the worst of the cold. Constance stayed up with him through the second night, bringing hot coffee and taking turns watching the fire so he could rest for even an hour. And it was in the quiet hours before dawn, both of them exhausted and watching the flames together, that she finally asked the question that had been building in her for weeks. "Why did you come to my door that morning instead of simply keeping the provisions and staying angry that a stranger left charity on your doorstep?" she asked. Silas considered the question seriously before answering. "Because Eliza used to say pride was a poor substitute for gratitude properly expressed," he said. "And because whoever left that crate clearly understood something about dignity that most charity misses entirely, leaving a man away to accept help without feeling smaller for needing it. I wanted to know the kind of person who thinks that carefully about a stranger's pride." Constance looked at him in the firelight, something warm and unguarded finally breaking fully through her careful composure. "I nearly didn't leave it at all," she admitted. "I stood outside your door for a full 10 minutes, deciding whether it would help or simply humiliate you further." "It helped," Silas said quietly. "More than you likely understand." Constance was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire before she spoke again, her voice softer than before. "Tell me about Eliza," she said, "if you're willing to." Silas stared into the flames for a long while before answering. "She had a way of making even the leanest winters feel survivable," he said. "She used to say the herd could be rebuilt, that livestock was never the thing worth grieving over." I think losing them broke something in her anyway, some belief she'd carried that we'd always find a way through. I keep wondering if I'd found different work sooner, somewhere less tied to animals that could simply sicken and die overnight. She might still have had that belief left in her when it mattered most. Constance reached over and covered his hand with her own. Edmund and I lost a child 8 years into our marriage, she said quietly, a grief she had carried alone for far too long, finally finding words in the quiet cottage. 6 months along, and then simply gone, with no explanation the doctor could ever properly give us. We never tried again after that, both of us too afraid of losing something else we'd let ourselves hope for. When he died 3 years ago, I told myself the ranch would have to be enough, that hoping for a family had cost me too much grief already to risk it a second time. Silas turned his hand to hold hers properly. "And now?" he asked softly. Constance managed a small, unsteady smile. "Now I find myself rocking your son to sleep some evenings and forgetting, for whole stretches of time, that I ever told myself any such thing at all." Word of the arrangement spread through Cottonwood Falls exactly as Silas had feared it might. Women at the mercantile whispered that the widow Whitfield had taken a peculiar interest in some penniless dairyman she'd found nearly begging at her own counter, that loneliness had clearly gotten the better of her judgment, that a man with nothing to his name would surely take advantage of her generosity before the year turned properly. Otis Bennett, who had quietly helped arrange the anonymous delivery in the first place, finally spoke plainly in Silas's defense one afternoon at the mercantile counter. "I've known Constance Whitfield since she first came to this county as Edmund's bride," Otis said. "I've never once seen her take an interest in a man's circumstances the way she took an interest in yours, Hartwell, and I've watched that dairy operation turn a genuine profit for the first time in 3 years since you arrived. Whatever this town wants to whisper about charity and pride, I've watched you earn every dollar of that wage with my own eyes." Constance heard the rest of the town's whispers herself and let them slide past her like rain off an oiled coat, though the true danger arrived not as gossip but as a terrible, sudden fear on a February afternoon when Abel disappeared from the dairy cottage without a trace. Silas had left Abel briefly in the care of a young dairy hand's wife while he attended to a sick calf in the barn, and when he returned less than an hour later, the woman was frantic, insisting Abel had simply wandered off while she'd turned her back to tend the stove, and no amount of searching the immediate cottage grounds had turned up any sign of the boy. Panic seized Silas with a force he had not felt since Eliza's death, and within minutes the entire dairy operation had joined the search, fanning out across the surrounding fields as a light snow began falling once more, threatening to erase whatever small tracks a 2-year-old might have left behind. Silas ran the length of the barn twice, calling his son's name before forcing himself to think rather than simply react, remembering everything he knew about a curious, restless boy's habits, every place Abel had ever wandered toward when left unsupervised even for a moment. The dairy hand's wife stood wringing her hands near the cottage door, apologizing over and over, but Silas had no time or temper left to spare for blame, only for the desperate, methodical work of finding his son before the cold and the coming dark could do what they'd already nearly done to his family once before. Constance rode out from the main house the moment word reached her, her own fear plain and immediate, understanding with a rancher's grim certainty exactly how dangerous open country could prove for a child too small to understand the cold's true threat. "The creek," she said suddenly, gripping Silas's arm. "Abel loves watching the water. If he wandered anywhere unsupervised, that's where a curious child would go first." They found small footprints leading toward the creek bank just as the light began fading and the snow thickened into something more serious, and Silas's heart nearly stopped at the sight of the tracks ending abruptly at the water's edge, the creek running fast and cold despite the season's freeze, ice forming unevenly along its banks in patches too thin to trust. "Abel!" Silas's voice tore raw across the darkening field, and for one terrible, endless moment there was no answer at all, only the wind and the rushing water and a silence that threatened to swallow every hope he had left. Then, faint but unmistakable, a small cry answered from further downstream, and Constance spotted him first, huddled against a fallen log on a narrow strip of bank, having wandered along the water's edge before slipping and scraping his knee badly enough to finally stop moving and simply cry for help. Silas half ran, half slid down the frozen bank and gathered his son into his arms, checking every inch of him with shaking hands, finding him cold and frightened and bruised but whole, alive, breathing. Constance reached them moments later, dropping to her knees in the snow beside them both, and it was she who first noticed Abel's hands had gone dangerously pale from the cold, his lips taking on a faint bluish tinge that sent fresh alarm through both adults. "We need to get him warm immediately," she said, already stripping off her own heavy coat to wrap around the child, despite Silas's protests that she'd freeze herself in the process. "I have more layers underneath than you do, Silas, and he needs it more than either of us right now." They carried Abel back to the main house rather than the smaller dairy cottage, Constance's fire already roaring by the time they arrived, and spent the following hours warming him by careful degrees, watching color slowly and mercifully return to his small fingers and toes. Silas sat beside his son through most of that evening, and it was Constance who finally convinced him to rest for even a few minutes, sitting with Abel herself while Silas dozed briefly in a nearby chair, exhaustion finally overtaking fear now that the immediate danger had passed. When Silas woke hours later, he found Constance still sitting with Abel curled against her, singing softly to the boy in a voice worn thin with relief and exhaustion both, and something in the scene struck him with a force greater than the fear he'd felt searching the creek bank. "You didn't have to stay through all of this," he said quietly. "I couldn't have left," Constance said simply, "not after everything. I don't think I could leave either of you now even if I wanted to, Silas, and I find I don't want to at all." Silas crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, looking at his sleeping son cradled safely against a woman who had, in the space of a few short months, become considerably more than a benefactor or an employer. "I've spent 2 years believing I'd lost everything worth holding on to," he said. "Tonight, watching you carry my son through that snow like he was your own, I understood I'd been wrong about that for longer than I care to admit." Constance's eyes filled with tears she no longer tried to hide. "The provisions I left at your door were meant to be anonymous," she whispered. "I never intended for any of this to become what it's become. I find I'm grateful every single day that it did anyway." Silas did not answer with words. He reached up and gently took her hand, and there beside the fire, with Abel sleeping safely between them, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of fleeting relief or exhausted gratitude. It was a kiss of promise, of survival, of two people who had each buried someone they loved and had somehow, against every hard frontier odd, found their way to standing together in the wreckage of a terrifying night. We are more than halfway through Constance and Silas's story now, and if a silent gift left before dawn has stirred something in you, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next tale from this same forgotten stretch of the Nebraska frontier. What do you think Cottonwood Falls will say once the whole town learns exactly what happened at that creek bank? Tell us in the comments which moment moved you most so far in Silas and Constance's story. Now, back to the dairy ranch, where spring was still weeks away, but something had already fundamentally changed between two people the frontier had tested rather severely. Abel recovered fully within days, his fright fading faster than either adults had, and by the time the worst of February's cold finally broke, the dairy operation was thriving under Silas's steady management, production higher than it had been in the operation's entire history. Word of the creek bank rescue spread through Cottonwood Falls alongside the earlier whispers about anonymous charity and hasty employment, and the combination finally silenced even the most persistent gossips, who found it considerably harder to doubt a man's character after watching the whole town turn out to search for his missing son. Otis Bennett took to telling the story at the mercantile counter to anyone who would listen, always ending it the same way, that he had never seen Constance Whitfield move as fast on horseback as she had the afternoon Abel went missing, grief for her own lost hopes apparently transforming instantly into fierce protective love the moment a child actually needed her. Spring arrived slowly across the Nebraska sandhills that year, the wildflowers blooming first along the very creek bank where Abel had been found, and Constance and Silas were married beneath the cottonwoods in a real ceremony. Wildflowers gathered by hands from across the county who had once merely whispered about the arrangement and now came bearing gifts instead, and a fiddle player from the Cottonwood Falls Saloon donating his afternoon for free, saying afterward he had never seen two people look at each other quite the way they did that day. Abel, walking steadily now and considerably more cautious around open water than he'd once been, wore a small suit of fine blue wool matching the shade of the coat Constance had wrapped him in that terrifying February evening. And when Otis lifted him up during the ceremony to see his parents exchange their vows, Abel reached out both small hands toward Constance and said, in the clear, uncomplicated way of a child who had never known her as anything else, the word Mama. Constance froze entirely still, one hand pressed to her heart, tears spilling freely down her face before she gathered Abel into her arms, holding him the way she had once dreamed of holding a child of her own, in a life that had finally, truly, stopped feeling empty. Years later, travelers passing through Cottonwood Falls still spoke of the Whitfield dairy operation, though most had long since started calling it something simpler, the Hartwell place, the family with the finest milk and the warmest hearth in the county for any traveler who came knocking hungry. Otis Bennett, grown grayer with each passing winter, still told the story of that December delivery to every newcomer who asked how the Hartwell family had come to settle at the ranch, always ending it the same way, that he had never seen a single crate of provisions accomplish quite so much good in one town before, and doubted he ever would again. Abel himself, grown into a steady young man who knew every cow on the dairy operation by name, liked to add his own piece to the story whenever asked, that he had once nearly frozen at a creek bank and been carried home in a woman's own coat before she'd even become his mother in name, and that he considered himself, by any honest measure, the luckiest boy Nebraska had ever raised. They no longer spoke with the cautious whispers of that first uncertain Christmas. They spoke with genuine wonder, the way people speak of something that had, against every hard lesson the frontier ever taught them, turned out right. Above the mantel in the main house, beside the small carved wooden cow worn smooth from years of handling, hung one of the original milk tins from that first anonymous crate, kept empty and polished as a keepsake of exactly where everything had begun. It started with a coin spent on Christmas milk, Constance liked to say to anyone who asked about it, and it ended with the truest family I ever thought I'd get to have. Family isn't always about the blood that runs in a person's veins. Sometimes it's about the people who notice a stranger counting his last coin and choose, quietly and without asking for credit, to make certain he never has to count that carefully again. It's about the hard bargains desperate people strike simply to survive a Nebraska winter, and the quiet grace that can turn those bargains into something that lasts a lifetime. If Silas and Constance's story stayed with you, tell us in the comments which moment moved you most. The crate left before dawn, the creek bank search, or the little boy who called her Mama for the very first time. Please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who still believes an anonymous kindness can change the entire course of a family's life. In our next story, a wealthy rancher's widow takes in a wounded stranger against her better judgment, only to discover the secret he carries could either save her land or destroy everything she has left. This is a fictional frontier romance inspired by the real hardships of the American West, and while it touches on grief, poverty, and the fear of losing a child, every difficult moment has been told with care and without graphic detail, brought to life here for your entertainment. Until the next trail, keep your fire burning and your heart open to the stranger at your gate. God bless the pioneers and God bless the hearts that refuse to break.